Yes, well, thanks a lot to the NATO Defense College, to you, and to all the audience. And of course, it's a pity that we're not all together in Rome, but let's make the best of it, and let's hope that the communication works via Zoom. I would like to build on what Professor Koppa, Marilena has presented on the Balkans, and I will try to present a bigger picture with a clear narrative thread. The thread is the question of how we went from peace to war, from war to peace, and what this trajectory of the last decades in the Western Balkans suggests is the challenge today. Now, if we look at a map of Europe, that map just shows us what we're all familiar with. But if we look at a map of Europe surrounding and at the news, what we see is that Europe is surrounded by armed conflict. There's been a war in Libya on and off since 2011 that shows no sign of ending. There's been a war in Syria, which is not yet over, with millions of displaced inside the country, that has been going on since 2011. There's a war in Ukraine, which is certainly not over, which has been waged since 2014. There's been a war in the Southern Caucasus last year between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which many had predicted for decades without really believing it would break out. But it reminds us that many of the conflicts of the 90s, which were frozen, could erupt at any moment. There's serious repression in another European country, Belarus, with a record number of political prisoners. So if we look at Europe in 2020, the conflicts of last year, including the Caucasus, Libya, Syria, Eastern Ukraine, Belarus, then we see that there is a zone of stability surrounded by war or serious repression. But if we look at the map of the 1990s and the conflicts at that time, we see what has changed. Yes, in the 1990s, you also had a war in Abkhazia and Ossetia between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You had fighting in Transnistria in the early 90s, and you had a civil war in Algeria. You also still had the troubles in Northern Ireland. But the area that then occupied the European and global attention was a series of wars in the Western Balkans. Croatia, Bosnia, a short war in Slovenia, a very long war in Bosnia, a war in Kosovo, another at the end already, 2001, threat of civil war in North Macedonia. So the question is, where will we be in 2030? Will the Western Balkans again unfreeze like the Caucasus? Will we see a return to war in the next decade? A decade is a long time in politics. Or will we be able to spread the zone of democratic peace with the Balkans a part of it? Now let's look at some of the headlines of the Balkans in the last year or 12 months. March 2020, national elections in North Macedonia. A government that made peace with Greece and reached a far-reaching agreement wins the elections. March 2020, North Macedonia joins NATO as the 30th member. June 2020, Serbia's President Aleksandar Vučić wins national elections. August 2020, national elections in Montenegro, where the long governing party of President Đukanović is for the first time, as a result of these elections, not part of the governing coalition. November 2020, local elections in Bosnia, the 7th local elections since the war, completely without incidents, with some of the major cities changing hands from the previous parties to new parties. February this year, Kosovo, national elections, a sweep, a completely new arrival of a new party winning an absolute majority, which had only been in power for a very short time, temporarily, now dominating the politics of Kosovo. And April, of course, just a few days ago, national elections in Albania. Now, what we see here is actually quite remarkable. We are talking about elections, not war. Elections, not coups. Elections, not breakdown of regimes. So, despite a legacy of conflict from the 90s, and despite extremely diverse societies in all of these Western Balkan countries, it seems that these headlines would allow us to take Balkan peace for granted. Well, to make this point about diversity, just look at some of the realities of the region today. The last census in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 30% or 31% of the country are Serbs, the biggest group, just barely a majority, 50% are Bosniaks, 15% are Croats, 4% others and undeclared. This is not very far from the ethnic composition of Bosnia before the war. Or look at Montenegro, which actually has no majority at all. 45% declared themselves to be Montenegrins, again about 30% Serbs. And then you have a lot of minorities, Bosniaks in the north, Albanians in the south, people who declare themselves as Muslims but not Bosniaks, of course Roma, and then Croats. Look at Albania. Well, everybody speaks Albanian with two very different dialects, but the religious diversity is striking too. 59% Muslims, 10% Catholics, 7% Orthodox, 2% declaring themselves as Bektashi, and then, of course, a quarter of the population which doesn't say. If we look now at the government and what this means, well, look at the government of North Macedonia. This is the government in power in Skopje today. 23 ministers, 10 of them are from minorities. The deputy prime minister, actually 2 of them are Albanian. The minister of foreign affairs, the minister of finance, the minister of economy, the minister of agriculture. This is as diverse, as multi-ethnic a government as you can imagine. Or look at the current government of Republika Srpska. Now this surprises many, but in this government in Republika Srpska, just look at Minister of Justice, a Croat, Minister of Health, a Bosniak, the Minister of Administration, of EU integration, of ecology, of family and youth are all Bosniaks. Now, this shows us that the power of the ballot has been able in recent years to actually direct power struggles and diversity and tensions into issues to be resolved at elections. This is an amazing achievement, and I don't think people realize it often enough, especially if you lift your eyes and look around Europe and you see that everywhere around Europe, this vision of elections regularly held, deciding who rules, is not realized. Just take Bosnia and Herzegovina, which so often and falsely is described as a failed state. I mean, is this a failed state where you've had regular elections, 8 times parliamentary, 7 times municipal, each time followed very often by changes in governments? This is actually, if we look back at 1996, quite an astonishing record. Bosnia has had 11 different prime ministers from 7 different parties. It's not true that the country is run by 3 ethnic groups and their parties. That's been true in 1996. It's been long outdated as a view. And the governments have changed. SDS, HDZ, SDP, PDP. You know, I will not go into the acronyms, but this is actually true at all levels of the country. I could tell you the story of the 10 cantons where there have been regular changes after elections. It's a vision that outsiders who look superficially just miss because the prejudices about Bosnia are so strong. Bosnia is actually very similar in structure to Belgium. You have 3 units that are directly under the central state. In Belgium, it's Flanders, Wallonia, and Brussels. Here, it's Republika Srpska, Federation, and British District. And then you have 10 cantons inside the Federation, while in Belgium, you have 10 provinces. Now, at all of these levels, power is decided through elections. So the question then for us is, if we have this situation today, something clearly worked since the 90s. But what was it? What worked? What brought this region to this state of peace? And is it secure? What might happen next? And in order to answer this question, I want to go about it in 4 steps. First, look at the history that is still relevant. How did the Balkans end up in the inferno of the 90s? Second, what was the specific secret of an intervention that in the Balkans managed to produce a new reality, while in so much of the world, interventions don't work? Third, what is the present state of peace, really? And fourth, let's forecast what we might expect for the next 10 years and on what this will depend. So the story of the Inferno and back has, of course, to start with this. Yugoslavia as a multi-ethnic state of many units, federal units, which in 1979 was a peculiar communist country. It was non-aligned, it was not part of the Warsaw Pact. As a result, it received a huge amount of Western aid and credits, in some respects more than some European democracies from the United States. World Bank credits, grants. It was able to send its unemployed to work as guest workers in Western Europe, and it was open to tourists. In any respect, this looked like a country that would have an easier transition after the fall of communism than others. And young Yugoslavs actually were able to travel to the West, like this young man who studied law, who then worked for the mayor of Belgrade, who then became a manager of a company, manager of a bank, and re-emerged in the 80s. His name is Slobodan Milosevic. In 1984, the world looked to Bosnia or Yugoslavia to the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo. In 1984, an academic in this city, Sarajevo, was put on trial because and his name was Vojislav Šešelj at the University of Sarajevo, he suggested that in fact, all of this Yugoslav arrangement was very unjust, and that what actually was needed was to divide Bosnia peacefully, as he would say, based on the principles of humanism and democracy along ethnic lines between Serbia and Croatia. Now, he was tried, he actually went to jail, he was furious about this, and he too would re-emerge very soon. 1984 was also the year of the beginning of the rise of Slobodan Milosevic. He first took over the Communist Party in Belgrade, then he became the strongman in Serbia, and very soon, 2 years later, he held a speech. Like Šešelj, he had a vision of a different Yugoslavia. His vision was that there was a beautiful and happy world that could be reached if only the unjustly suffering country, by which he meant Serbia, would address a few issues that had to do with borders, the same idea that Šešelj had proposed in 1984. And for this, in a speech he held in Kosovo, he said it was important to prepare and be inspired by the heroes of the past. Kosovo heroism had inspired Serbs for centuries. There were armed battles that could no longer be excluded. There was a need for resolve, bravery, and sacrifice. In 1990, I traveled as a tourist guide. I was then a student through the former Yugoslavia. I went to the National Park in Plitvice, I went to Banja Luka, I went to Mostar. And everywhere I asked people, because in the news there were these stories that there might be conflict. And I remember distinctly how in Mostar local people told me, a conflict is impossible. We are so mixed. 30% of the population of our town has married members of another ethnic group. Conflict can't erupt in Bosnia. Well, in 1991, conflict did erupt. In 1991, conflict did erupt in the bloody Easter in Croatia. It then spread to the Adriatic. In the autumn of 1991, there was fighting around the tourist hub of Dubrovnik, which was bombed by the Yugoslav army. By 1992, the war had spread to Bosnia, and the ideas of ethnic partition were put into action. And there he was again, our intellectual, Vojislav Šešelj, the Sarajevo young academic, and his ideas. Now he created a paramilitary group, and the activities that he now engaged in later led him to be tried for war crimes in The Hague. Now, on his side, what you see here is a young man. He was the general secretary of his party at the time when it was at its most radical in its views on Bosnia. This young man is Aleksandar Vučić, a man who would reappear in our story again. He's today's president of Serbia. Now, in the war, intellectuals played a big role. Biologists, poets, scholars. These three, for example, were the leaders of the Bosnian Serbs. Biljana Plavšić, she was a biology professor at the University of Sarajevo. Radovan Karadzic, who was a poet and saw himself in the great tradition of Serb poets of the past. And the vice president of Republika Srpska, Mr. Koljević, who was a Shakespeare scholar and translator of Shakespeare into Serbia. They led their people into a 3-year war that ended in genocide. Sarajevo suffered the longest siege of any city since the Second World War, 1,425 days of siege, of snipers, and of destruction. And in 1993, when the head of the UN peacekeepers in Bosnia spoke to Congress, he saw in this the true law of humanity, that it was all about force. Since the first caveman picked up a club and occupied his neighbor's cave and ran off with his wife, the future of Europe, the future of the Balkans would be simply determined not by ideals, not by values, not by the noble principles that were adopted after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Paris Declaration of the OSCE. No, by force. And this, of course, was at the time a vision that many academics had too, inspired by the catastrophe of the Balkans. Samuel Huntington at Harvard wrote about the clash of civilizations. John Mersheimer, another American academic, wrote about the illusion that there would be a democratic peace, the illusion that democratic elections would lead to peace. In fact, no, democratic elections would lead to nationalists seizing power and declaring war on each other. And then in Bosnia, the war took another turn when not only the initial attacks by Serb forces supported by Milosevic, but also war broke out between Croats and the Bosnian army, which was mainly Bosniak, but not only, with massacres in the center of Bosnia, like this one morning when 116 civilians were killed in the city of Amici. In 1993, many people thought that the war would never end. At that time, Peter Galbraith was ambassador of the US to Croatia, and he predicted that for the next 20 years there would be war in the Balkans, like in Lebanon. And finally, of course, Srebrenica, the most famous and most somber and most tragic moment in a story of tragic moments in the summer of 1995, when 8,000 men and boys were killed in cold blood in what the International Tribunal in The Hague defined as genocide. This was a shock. Genocide in the middle of Europe, in a UN safe haven, but it was a shock that led to a reaction. And if you want to understand this shock, I actually highly recommend this film, which was one of the 5 entries for the Oscars, Quo Vadis Aida, a film that was made by a Bosnian filmmaker that, if you get a chance to see, reminds us of what happened at Srebrenica. So, given this descent into the inferno, the hell of war and ethnic cleansing and genocide, how did intervention work? I wrote a book on this 10 years ago, which I gave as a present to the library in the NATO Defense College, so it might be there, or you can still get it, with a British friend, Rory Stewart, who was later the chair of the Defense Committee in the British House of Parliament. And what I will present now, you find a lot more on this there. In particular, the view from the early 90s during the Kosovo-Bosnia war that intervention was useless. There were these experts like John Keegan, a great scholar of war, who said that in order to understand Bosnia, you need to think of it as a tribal conflict. Like Huntington, it was groups who couldn't but fight. And with a tribal conflict, of course, there's nothing you can do. Or that intervention would be requiring so many troops that it would be impossible. This was another British general, Michael Dewar from the International Institute of Strategic Studies, who in February 93 warned that you couldn't intervene because it would require 500,000 men, which was impossible. Nobody had these amounts of troops available. But in the summer 95, after Srebrenica, a change happened. The United States decided that it could no longer watch what was happening. NATO was at stake. The future of Europe, they feared, was at stake. And so an American diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, engaged in what he called muscular diplomacy, which is another great story. And again, I recommend the book highly. To End the War is one of the best books I've read on diplomacy, where Richard Holbrooke describes what happened next. The US military began to support some of the local allies, which it hadn't done for a while, especially the army in Croatia, not openly, but informally. It then engaged in airstrikes, which hit the Bosnian Serb army, and this together turned the fortune of the war. It led to peace talks, as it looked as if the Bosnian Serbs would lose the war. They could lose even Banja Luka. There was an army, the Croat army and the Bosnian army, approaching Banja Luka, and it was Richard Holbrooke who said, stop, don't take Banja Luka, don't continue your conquest. Instead, we use this pressure to get everyone to the Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, at which the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed. And as Richard Holbrooke said, talking to the people who had in fact committed genocide in Srebrenica, and he knew it, in order to go to peace, Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, in order to save Jews, Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, had met Mr. Eichmann, the responsible man for the Holocaust, to save Hungarian Jews, in the same way he was prepared to meet the man, and it was mainly men who had committed genocide, in order to get to peace. The US interest was to end the nightmare, as President Clinton put it at the time, and to save NATO. And Richard Holbrooke added, the US would only deploy troops if there were ironclad guarantees that they would not be shot at. And this he received. Now, this he received because the US made clear that its interest was limited. It would not conduct nation building, as the general who was in charge of the Joint Chief of Staff at the time put it, Salikashvili. It will not be a police force. It will maintain a ceasefire to prevent a war from accidentally starting. And as another US diplomat who was later ambassador to NATO put it, Ivo Dalda, Dayton was to provide a breathing space to arm one of the two armies which remained in place by Dayton, the Federation Army, to have deterrence inside the country. Now, this was supposed to be a one-year mission with very limited objectives, no regime change, elections to be held within a year. The former nationalists, the party of Radovan Karadzic, actually won these elections, and there was no real refugee return in 1996. But then, in a region still in turmoil, with the collapse of the state in Albania, with another war in Kosovo breaking out in 1999, with more ethnic cleansing and 1 million people displaced, with NATO intervening once again, and with, of course, NATO bombing of strategic buildings in Belgrade, and with the question, will Balkan wars ever end, something happened. After the Kosovo war, with Bosnia still in an uneasy ceasefire, with NATO in shock for having had to intervene a second time in a few years, the leaders of the free world, President Clinton, Jacques Chirac, Gerhard Schröder, everybody came to Sarajevo, and in June 1999 declared at the Sarajevo summit that from now on, this would be made impossible. We will work together to promote the integration of Southeast Europe into a continent where borders will no longer denote division, but offer the opportunity of contact and cooperation. The vision of Sarajevo of summer 99, just after the end of the Kosovo War, was we will work on making borders in the Balkans something that people will no longer fight about, something that, like in the rest of Europe, will become invisible. Now, this required dealing with past crimes. And one of the great success stories of these last 2 decades is, in fact, this, the International Justice of the ICTY. One of the very best books, and again, I highly recommend it, is this by Julian Borger. It's a magnificent story of how the 161 indictees of the International Tribunal in The Hague were brought to justice. And it is a great story for NATO because units of different NATO members engaged in some daring manhunt in the Balkans to catch those people and bring them to The Hague that stands to trial. But this had a massive impact because after the fall of Milosevic in 2000, it meant that even heads of state like Milosevic could be put on trial. Now, Milosevic on trial was more than just the trial of a man. It was the trial of an idea, the idea that in the name of raison d'etat, of reason of state, you could commit crimes, that it was fine to support ethnic cleansing, that it was fine in order to defend your group to engage in the bombing of civilians in Sarajevo. Now, it wasn't just Milosevic, but also Radovan Karadzic, who was captured and tried. And instead of being a hero to whom monuments would be built as he had expected in his poetic, romantic vision, Radovan Karadzic ended up being sentenced for genocide and is now in jail. And the same, of course, applied to the man most responsible for Srebrenica, Ratko Mladic, the general of the Bosnian Serbs, with the strong finding that ethnic cleansing is a crime. Now, the tribunal didn't just sentence and try Serbs, it also investigated and sentenced members of other ethnic groups. And so in the end, it left a legacy that certain things in war are never legitimate. Now, at the same time, the Sarajevo Summit Declaration coincided with another story that would now take over the narrative about the Balkans, this story of enlargement. In 1999, shortly before the Kosovo conflict, NATO had first enlarged, including to Poland, of course, and Hungary. And the promise of EU enlargement took another boost in December 1999, when at Helsinki, the EU promised to start accession talks with a large number of countries, including Bulgaria and Romania, which wasn't clear for a very long time whether that would happen. And this changed at one go the geography of the Balkans, because as you see at the map, with the promise of Bulgaria and Romania, and then their accession in 2007, the Western Balkans became an island surrounded like Switzerland by the European Union. So now there was a new promise. The promise was that if these countries joined the EU, they could partake in the amazing economic success story of other countries preparing to join the EU, Estonia, Poland, but also Romania and Bulgaria. If you look at that GDP increase per capita between 2001 and 2012, this is as a share of the average GDP in the EU, you'll see that Romania almost doubled its GDP. It has since continued, and in the meantime, Romania has overtaken in GDP per capita Croatia. A massive transformation in people's lives all around the Balkans. So now, the narrative in Brussels was that there was a direction for history and for the region. Enlargements create a united and peaceful continent, was what Javier Solana put in the EU's strategy put out in 2003. And Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, and so free. Peace and stability would spread. It was a bold vision. And it was a vision confirmed in Thessaloniki when the leaders of the EU promised to the Western Balkans that they too, like Romania and Bulgaria, would be able to join this Pax Europiana. Now, by 2006, the transformation had accelerated. The US could withdraw its troops from Bosnia, and there were no casualties in its whole mission. It could withdraw safely because Bosnia had left behind integrated defense forces. 1 million refugees had returned within a few years. Complete freedom of movement in Bosnia, which there still is today, and elections held peacefully. And if you look at the local level, which we don't have the time, you will see dramatic transformations, like in this town of Doboj, which was in Republika Srpska, all the mosques destroyed in the war, all the mosques rebuilt since. You hear the call to prayer when you go to Doboj today, and half the Bosniak population had returned. Today in Republika Srpska, there are more than 200,000 non-Serbs living again. And the goal was that there would be zero. The transformation in the rhetoric, which, as you remember, with the bombing of Dubrovnik, was at the center of the early years of the war. Well, now all members of the former Yugoslavia are members of NATO, and the Adriatic is a NATO sea. And in Serbia, the break of the past, well, here are the two men again, the radicals from the 90s, Vojislav Šešelj and Aleksandar Vučić. Šešelj, of course, was taken to The Hague and he was sentenced. Aleksandar Vučić changed his opinions, changed his politics, and became president of Serbia, trying and promising to take Serbia to the EU. So one thing is clear, this prediction was a very bad one, that intervention never worked. As Cato, a US think tank, put it, history records no instance where ethnic groups have shared power after large-scale civil war. Well, that just was plain wrong. And it was wrong because of these lessons. Lift and strike and regional allies could bring a truth. There were no Balkan lessons for what was later attempted in Iraq or Afghanistan, because this was not nation building under fire. It was a very cautious effort which very slowly enlarged its objectives. But in order to make these last, it relied also on the transformations in neighboring countries. The region around Bosnia changed as Slobodan Milosevic fell and as Croatia wanted to join the EU. And the ICTY and justice, which was slow and expensive, transformed the narrative of what was legitimate. The ideas and stories of what the future would bring mattered hugely. And they could change. In the 90s, the story was ethnic consolidation. After 99, the story was European integration and making borders invisible. So where are we today? Well, here's the thing. The region isn't catching up. The region isn't catching up because it isn't actually part of the European Union. As Marilena Koppa pointed out, it is largely stuck. This has made it vulnerable to interventions from the outside. Now, yes, Turkey is a player. Yes, China is a player. But the one player that has engaged the most aggressively and directly, of course, has been Russia, with Russian interventions by some of the very same units which later turned up in other NATO members, the military intelligence and people who'd been present and active in Ukraine, trying to provoke havoc in the Balkans. But there's also a change inside the Balkans. These are some headlines from Serbian newspaper, and they haven't really changed much. I took them from one day in December 2018. And these are the tabloids close to the president that keep writing about war. The Shqiptars, Albanians, which is a derogatory term, will be attacking Serbs. Serbs will be unprepared. This is what, at that time, Minister of Defense of Serbia said. The Albanians are carrying out silent ethnic cleansing. This is happening inside Serbia. Or everyone is waiting, as President Vučić put it in August 2018, for an opportunity to strike, by which he meant a military strike. Or the conflict in Kosovo was no longer frozen and big armed clashes might erupt at any moment. Aleksandar Vučić in November 2018. Or no other country in the former Yugoslavia is as strong as we are, and we will strengthen our military dramatically. Aleksandar Vučić in November 2018. Or Greater Albania is being created and is a threat to the entire region. Now, this kind of rhetoric, including by the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, actually makes war thinkable again. Ivica Dačić, who used to be the spokesman of Milosevic's party at the time of the Kosovo War, in November 2018, he said, if there is any attack on the Serbs in North Kosovo, we will involve our military. Or the Serb member of the Bosnian presidency, Milorad Dodik, that in Bosnia all the issues are open. A mistake was made to keep Bosnia together. Or in April 2019, if we want a stable Balkans, borders have to be redrawn. Now, this is exactly the idea that Vojislav Šešelj and Slobodan Milosevic had developed in the 1980s that had led to the disasters of the 90s. And given that the diversity of these countries is as high now as it was then, the consequences are likely to be as disastrous. But at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I took this picture in 2019, this is the slogan. If Kosovo is not Serbia, Republika Srpska is not Bosnia, linking all these issues and suggesting that all the borders might still be changed. Now, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, when this debate reached its climax in summer 2018, made very clear that she was opposed to questioning the territorial integrity of any state. And she said that we must repeat again and again that there can be no talk on borders. But Angela Merkel will not be German Chancellor beyond this autumn. And other leaders in Europe seemed at the time much more open to restarting these debates. So what will happen in the next decade? Forecasting is not an exact science. It is like telling the intensity of the ice on which we are skating without actually being able to measure it. So we don't know when it will break. The rhetoric of recent years suggests that something dangerous might be going on. So will the Balkans be peaceful for the next 10 years? What do people in the Balkans think themselves about their future? What are their filters through which they interpret what their options are? Well, one of the filters is that it is not clear, wasn't clear a few years ago, on the one hand, if the EU itself has a future with Brexit and other countries and populist leaders suggesting that, you know, this whole European project was a mistake even for the West. Now, this fear has abated in recent years and the European Union looks more solid today, though we will see what happens at elections in some big member states. But the other fear is there is a European Union, but the Balkans are like Vladimir and Estragon in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. They will never enter. It's a region waiting for a promise that will never come true. Thessaloniki was 18 years ago in 2003. And as these two characters on stage put it, shall we go? Yes, let's go. But nothing ever changes. As Alexander Vučić, the Serbian president, put it on NATO in October 2018, NATO will not give a security guarantee. Now, at the time, of course, President Trump had questioned the security guarantee for Montenegro. Fortunately, this too has changed. But on the EU, Alexander Vučić has been prophetic. He said to the other regional leaders in October 2018, I will tell you, you are not joining the European Union soon. And when all the other countries will be told this will increase stability and insecurity. The unfulfilled promises of Europe will disappoint. And when he said that 2.5 years ago, it wasn't clear that, in fact, 2.5 years later, as Marilena Koppa pointed out, no accession talks would start with North Macedonia, nor with Albania, nor would there be any progress for any of the other countries. The European Union, the European project, is completely stuck. And certainly Alexander Vučić has been very vocal about this. European solidarity does not exist, he said 1 year ago in Tirana. It was a fairy tale. And what he used was, of course, also the story of the pandemic, where he said that the only people who've been helping Serbia to get vaccines have been China and its great president. Europe is useless, Europe is not credible, and Europe is not, therefore, a realistic future. In the meantime, Serbia is spending a lot of money on its military. That too is striking. It's spending more alone than the whole of the Western Balkan Five together and not letting up. What is the point of all these tanks that Serbia is purchasing? In the context of what Marilena Koppa already pointed out, the EU shock that first France and then Bulgaria have blocked accession talks, even for countries that did everything that they were asked to do. So the reality today is this. Serbia and Montenegro are engaged in never-ending accession talks. They are not actually closing any chapters, ever. They are stuck. The only chapters they closed were fake chapters, which you open and close in one day. Albania and North Macedonia have not started talks. Now, if they would start talks, they would be never-ending accession talks, but they're not even allowed to get to that stage. And Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo are not even candidates, but lost in limbo. And against this context, recently, a non-paper appeared, which this was just a few weeks ago, created huge debates in the region. It was allegedly written by the Prime Minister of Slovenia, who has denied this, and it's not yet clear. But what is important is that this non-paper was perceived and read against the background of all the debates on borders in recent years that we've already talked about. The idea that perhaps Serbia and Kosovo could reach a peace by having ethnic divides. The idea that if you do that in Kosovo, why not do it also in other parts of the world, other parts of the Balkans like Bosnia? So this was a map suggested in this non-paper, which was discussed, which basically says, let's undo everything we've done to build these multi-ethnic states. Let's return to the drawing board. Let's destroy these states. And as you can imagine, this creates a terror among people, minorities and people who are interested in peace in the Balkans. Stories, to conclude, are deadly serious. If we believe the story that the Western Balkans has a European future, if leaders in the region believe it, and if their public and voters believe it, it has an enormous effect on politics. But if they stop believing it and believe again in the stories of the 80s, that the future is ethnic borders, that the future is destroying these states, the future is preparing for struggle, battles, we can be sure that the stability in the Balkans will go the way of the stability in the Caucasus. Now, can the EU win this battle of ideas, and how? Will the EU remain, as it was promised in 1999 in Sarajevo and in 2003 in Thessaloniki, an attraction that is credible in Balkan politics? Let me conclude with something my colleagues and I have been pushing for the last 2 years. Now, this is our recommendation, which is how to fill this void of constructive ideas. We need to urgently return to the original vision of European integration. It is clear these countries will not be let in as full members in the near future because too many member states are skeptical for many reasons, and that's a different debate. But what we should return to is the core idea of European integration, which was that Europe for decades was a project of integration through interests, coal and steel and the common market. Until 1992, when European Economic Community became the European Union, it was economic integration. And this economic integration we should offer to all the Western Balkans today. If they meet the criteria, if they make the reforms, they should be able to partake in the four freedoms in a Nordic-style integration in the way the European Union offered it to Sweden and Finland and Austria and Norway in 1989. And in the way Norway still is integrated with the EU, not a member, but part of the economic area. Now, the idea would be that the Balkans could be like Finland after it joined the European Economic Area. This would be the same destination as membership, but it would be an interim step. It would be about the substance of reform. It would be about more funding. It would be about integration with Europe, and it would be about making borders invisible. As we have seen in Ireland in recent years, an invisible border is a major contribution to peace. And if you add to this the idea of Swiss borders in the Balkans, Switzerland, another country that is not a member of the EU, but where there are no checks on people crossing, this is how the Swiss border to Germany looks. If you actually extend the principles of Schengen to the region, where they work together and then no longer need to control who crosses these borders, you could return to the idea of invisible borders. And this is a very old vision. Let me quote a wise person who explained this. There is a remedy to the instability in Europe, he put it. And if this remedy would be adopted by the great majority of people in many lands, it could transform the whole scene and in a few years make all Europe or the greater part of it as free and as happy as Switzerland is today. This was a speech delivered in 1946 by a man that Marilena Koppa also referred to, Winston Churchill, in Zurich. So how can Europe become as free and happy, which means as peaceful and harmonious despite diversity as Switzerland? What is this remedy? It is to recreate the European fabric, as much of it as we can, and create a structure to dwell in peace, safety, and freedom. It is the idea of a democratic peace, which is what worked in Western Europe, which is what was extended with enlargement, and which was the promise of 1999 and 2003 for the Balkans. So the sooner Europeans and leaders in Europe revive and fill this vision with content, the more likely this promise of democratic peace that Churchill announced in Zurich in 1946 will be realized in the Balkans. And the sooner we come to this map, a map of Europe without conflicts. Thanks a lot. This is a website where a lot of the reports that my colleagues and I wrote can be found with more information on all of this. And I thank you for your